Hi, I'm Anatole, and this is my review for The Crown, Season 1, Episode 4, titled Act of God, which scored 8.7 on IMDb, and that's out of 2,800 votes. And if you're following my reaction series with Min on YouTube, you may be wondering why I'm doing a review instead of a reaction. Well, the main reason is because of various circumstances, mainly Tet and illness. It's been 2 weeks since Min and I have done a reaction video, and I wanted to keep up the schedule, so hopefully Min will be here in another week for us to do a reaction video. And because I've already seen the episode, I decided rather than trying to do a reaction video to an episode I'd already seen, I would just do a review. So I hope you will continue to stay with me as I do the review, and if that doesn't interest you, then please come back for Episode 5, when there should be Min sitting next to me. We'll be doing a reaction video. So, first thing I'm going to do is go over the plot of the episode, and the plot summary is courtesy of Wikipedia. Episode 4, Act of God. Director Julian Gerald and the writer Peter Morgan, aired November 4th, 2016. In December 1952, a great smog forms over London, reducing visibility and killing thousands while hospitalizing thousands more. And I was familiar, I'd heard about this incident before, and as I mentioned last episode, I've purchased the companion to The Crown. There are three volumes now, one for each season, and the chapter that goes over this episode talks about how the incident is real, but a lot of the politicking that happens in this has been changed and massaged for the show. So there is not a one-to-one correspondence. There are some liberties taken with the story. Elizabeth's advisors pressure her to ask Churchill, who refers to the event as an act of God, to step down. And I thought that was interesting in this episode. That theme about God plays over again and again, because you have the scene where Queen Mary tells Elizabeth that her role as the queen is bestowed and informed by God. She is in her own way acting in the service of God as a queen. And that was a very moving scene. One of my favorite scenes in the episode is that scene between Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth. But we also see there are other players who have to accommodate these roles that they're in, where their agency has been limited. And we see that with Prince Philip, and we also see that with the labor minister. And so as Min has commented before about that crown is a metaphor, not just a real thing. We see how the crown that symbolizes power, all these different people in their own attempt are trying to grab at it. And we see that here when Mountbatten tries to pressure the Queen to ask Winston Churchill to step down from his position as the Prime Minister. While initially reluctant to do so, Elizabeth summons him, being Churchill, for a private audience after he comes under fire for refusing to discuss the smog at a cabinet meeting. And that was a very interesting scene where we see Churchill getting angry about the deadly smog, and he derisively calls it just the weather. And one way that the episode parallels events of current politics has to do with the environmental movement. And we see at the end of the episode the effect of the Great Smog led to the passing of the Clean Air Act 4 years later in England. And my reading on Reddit, so research for the episode, I read the companion to the series, The Crown. I've begun reading a very thick biography of Queen Elizabeth that was published about 4 years ago, just before the Crown TV show came out. And I also watched a BBC documentary that came out around the time of, I think, Elizabeth's 80th birthday. So I did a substantial amount of research. But in addition to that, I also read the Reddit forums for episode 4 of The Crown. And someone mentioned that they had taken a class on the environmental policy, and that they studied the Great Fog in London because that Clean Air Act was significant to the environmental movement in America as well. Before the audience takes place, Churchill learns his secretary was killed after being run over by a double-decker bus. And so this secretary, the name of her being Venetia Scott, she is a pure invention of the series. And that's what I learned from reading the companion to the TV show. And while she's a composite figure, but the companion to the TV show points directly to a 21-year-old that worked with Winston Churchill. That Churchill said she was just like a young fairy, and that Churchill had a very paternal relationship with I think like the 12 secretaries that worked for him. There was a room converted into an office that was opposite Churchill's office, so that he could call them at any minute, any hour of the day, for them to take dictation. And that this relationship, this paternal relationship, we see play out between him and Venetia Scott. The way that they tied that back into his relationship with Queen Elizabeth, because there's been a very wary relationship between them. And we see somewhat a breaking of the ice when, at the end of the episode, after the Queen Elizabeth declines to put pressure on Churchill to step down, and Churchill becomes aware of the fact that she's making some political maneuvering, and he praises her to his wife. I think that's a sign that now their relationship is going to begin warming up a little bit, as it did in his historical relationship between them. He later makes an impassioned speech promising a longer-term approach to preventing future smog, and that's where Peter Morgan returns to the idea of wartime Churchill, that Churchill is portrayed as this doddering figure that's past his prime. And they talk about this in the companion, that around this period Churchill suffered a mini stroke and was left speechless and incognizant for the better part of a day. And we see that he doesn't have all his marbles, really, but that when the situation becomes quite dire and he needs to, he's able to rise to the occasion. And he does that by making a good speech and calling upon the figure that he was during World War II. And we see that again here in this episode. Both the speech and the smog's sudden disappearance prompt Elizabeth to change her mind at the moment Churchill arrives at Buckingham Palace. And then there we see that the smog breaks and the sun shines through. It's a very beautiful moment, and it's left to the audience to divine that all that leads to Elizabeth's change of plan. Philip, meanwhile, receives flying lessons from Royal Air Force Group Captain Pete Townsend, who is engaged in a clandestine relationship with Margaret. Well, that relationship's not anything to do with the plot of this episode, but it's quite interesting that the scene between Philip and Peter bookends the episode. We start with them and we finish with them. And I think I have that in my notes about how they also do the episode does a great way of tying in Elizabeth's personal relationships with her position as queen, how it's so hard for her to separate the two, and the way that all that also plays into the politics of the time. So that is the plot, more or less. Now I'm going to go over my notes for the episode. And before I begin doing that, I need to say that I think this was the weakest written episode out of all of them so far, because there's some really clunky exposition. I have 3 examples I took. So returning to my notes now, episode has a lot of exposition, characters talking about things they should already know, and then I have examples. So 1, Prince Philip to Pete Townsend, you fought in the Battle of Britain, didn't you? But it's mentioned in the companion to the book that Pete Townsend was something of a celebrity, and that his exploits in the Battle of Britain made him one of the most decorated and lauded soldiers in World War II, especially before his role in the Battle of Britain. And that fame and that renown was what got him the position working in the palace to begin with. So Prince Philip would have been intimately aware already of this. So that is only to let us, the viewers, know about his backstory. B, does Denora mean anything to you? No. Well, then let me tell you everything about it. Denora is the town that suffered the environmental poisoning that led Harry Truman to take action. And that's all just info dump. Nurse to the Queen. The Queen is here. Queen Mary says, which one? And the nurse says, "Oh, there's more than one." Well, of course, the nurse would have known. I'm sure she would have been briefed before ever going into work with the Queen Mary. Again, all that terrible exposition just was there to let the viewers know, but it breaks the reality because the characters begin saying things they realistically wouldn't say. So Venetia Scott wasn't real. I mentioned all that. Oh yeah, the thing that bothered me was the bloodless death of Venetia. When Churchill goes to see her body, he pulls off the tarp, and we see her face. It's all beautifully made up and serene, and there's not a speck of blood, even though she just died by being struck by a bus, and I'm sure suffered head trauma. And there would have been, to kill her, there would have been some sort of open wound, but no, not at all. Bloodless death. Queen Mary tells Elizabeth about her role, her calling from God, and that it's her role to do nothing. And again, I mentioned that was my favorite scene in the episode. So Elizabeth's whole role, her whole life, is to be one where her agency is subjugated to that of being the queen. And while she may come to terms with it rather quickly, I think we see that struggle that Prince Philip has with it, because not only does it take away his agency, in many ways it emasculates him, and we see that he is not happy at all with that. And the simple thing is flying, which any one of us could undertake if we had the means to do it. He has the means, but he doesn't have the license, because his personal life, all the actions of his personal life are no longer his, even though he is not the monarch. He's not the royal monarch, he's the consort. But still, he falls into that whole life, and he's not quite happy to do that. But we see that agency, the question of agency, and what role is the life of being a monarch? What humanity is left when your whole life is to do nothing? Clement Attlee didn't consider using the Great Fog to unseat Churchill, so that's one of the departures from history. And as the companion book notes, the two men, although they were in opposite parties, they respected each other. And for Churchill's, it was either his wedding anniversary or 80th birthday, I think it was a wedding anniversary, he invited Attlee, the leader of the opposition party, to come, because the two gentlemen had an understanding and some measure of respect. And as the book pointed out, and as we see in the show, the greater amount of tension and backstabbing comes from the members of his own party, not from the Labour Party. Venetia Scott's death was well done. Oh, so the level of craft. Peter Morgan, the writer, misdirects us a little bit by giving that character the task of trying to help her friend and to help the people in the hospital. So that character's goal right then is to go talk to Churchill and alarm him about the situation happening in the hospital. And we're carried up with that as she leaves the hospital. At least I was. I've read people on Reddit, they saw that death coming, but it got me by surprise. And so, at least in some measure, that misdirect worked for me. That is, the misdirect of getting us focused on the character's goal of meeting Churchill and not paying attention to her immediate circumstances and the immediate threat of being hit by a car. Recurring theme. Oh yeah, so the musical theme. The recurring musical theme we hear is the La Crise. I bet you spell check changes it. It says Lacrimosa, but I don't think that's the title. But it's a section from Mozart's Requiem in D minor. And the section lacrimose means to be full of sadness. And in Latin, translated to English, that section, the lyrics of it, full of tears will be that day when from the ashes shall arise the guilty man to be judged. Therefore spare him, O God, merciful Lord Jesus, grant them eternal rest. Amen. So again, that ties in with the title of Act of God. Throughout all the actions that happen in the episode, there's the question of, are these actions being done by men trying to grab power, men and women, or are they the agents of a higher being? You could argue that the death of Venetia Scott, because it alerted Churchill to the situation, the plight of the citizens of London, was an act of God to get Churchill to break out of his ignorance. So it's a well-written show. I just thought this was the weakest, mainly because of the exposition. But as far as the deeper meanings, the way the characters are developed, and some of the scenes, I think you can still see the work of a I will say master writer at hand. All right, so that should about do it for now. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you'll join me again on this channel. Until next time, take care and be well. Goodbye.